everybody. It's the next day, and as promised, because I never want to let anybody down, we are back into our manual, Chapter 2, Part 2. And this morning we're going to continue on with the pistons, etc. And I don't want to say I read ahead a little bit because I want you to have my reactions as I'm reading through this, but it's a lot of information. And so I did pull out a few little pointers here, but so let's get started. The pistons move back and forth in the cylinders and are sealed to the machined sides of the cylinders by the piston rings. The pistons are attached to the connecting rods by the piston pins, which go through the pistons so that the cylinder heads fit over the cylinders and contain the valves and valve train, which consists of the push rods from the bottom end and the rocker arms which push the valve open. The valves are returned to the closed position by the valve springs. There are two valves to each cylinder, one intake and one exhaust, and they are operated by the valve train to let the fuel mixture into the cylinder, which is the intake, and then let the burned gases out after the cylinder is fired, which is the exhaust. The heads and cylinders are held tight to the crankcase by long studs, which are screwed into the crankcase. The head nuts tighten this assembly down to the crankcase. The Volkswagen engine is a 4-cycle engine, which means each cylinder fires once every 2 revolutions. That is, that each cylinder requires 4 cycles or half revolutions for power production. Let's start with the gas in the tank and go through the complete schmutz. SCHMUTS. Definition to follow. The gasoline is sucked into the fuel pump and then pushed into the carburetor by a diaphragm, which is pushed up and down by the rod from the camshaft, which we discussed yesterday. The sucking, pushing action is obtained by wafer valves in the pump. One opens to suck and closes to push, and the other opens to push and closes to suck. The gasoline is thereby pushed into the carburetor bowl. There is a float in the carburetor which closes a float valve when the carburetor is full. The gasoline flows into the accelerator pump, which is used to pump liquid gas into the carburetor throat in a spray and is operated by the accelerator pedal. The gasoline also flows from the bowl to the jets, yada yada. There is a butterfly valve at each end of the carburetor. The top butterfly is the choke, and when closed, it limits the air intake into the carburetor throat, thereby making the gas to air mixture richer in gasoline. And the butterfly valve at the bottom of the carburetor opens the throat to the engine, and it is attached to the accelerator pedal, which controls the speed of the engine. The accelerator pump is used to add the necessary extra liquid gasoline when the pedal is pushed hard for extra power. And then all that to be said, electronic fuel injection types 3 and 4, AEFC fuel injection airflow controls types 1 and 2, electronic fuel pumps and filters, The unused gasoline is returned to the tank. I did not know that. The pressure is regulated by a pressure regulator, ironically, to keep constant supply of 28 psi fuel ready to be injected. I think this is the problem that I had with my bus this last weekend, is because I ended up with fuel coming out of the exhaust. So clearly I have some issue related to this. So we'll find out what that is. And so then there's, hang on one second here. In order to do its job, the control unit, oh yes, the electronic control unit, which is the brain, gets messages from various sensors, and it regulates how injectors are open for what amount of time, yada, yada, yada. In order to do its job, the control unit needs to know the temperature and pressure conditions it is going to inject fuel into, okay? It is connected to the crankcase or the manifold temperature sensor. And then finally to the timer on the distributor. There are other components for cold starts and rapid acceleration and electric relays to supply a constant voltage. However, under steady state conditions, the factors are temperature, pressure, and timing. That's a lot. The accelerator is connected by a cable to the throttle valve, which is another butterfly valve in the intake air distributor. When you push on the accelerator, the butterfly valve opens, allowing air from the air cleaner to enter the intake manifold, and then the pistons move up and down, and the cylinders start sucking air, and lots of things happen, and pushing whatever out of the exhaust system. And then I thought that this was interesting because it says the amount the butterfly valve is open, which is your foot pressure on the accelerator, determines the air pressure in the manifold. All right so far? No, I'm completely lost. And the pressure sensor connected to the manifold measures this air pressure and sends the dope along to the control unit. What does that mean? Somebody comment. When the engine is at idle, the throttle valve or the butterfly valve in the intake air distributor is closed, and air for idle is provided by the auxiliary air regulator. And then there's AFC fuel injection. When you push on the accelerator, the air flap opens, which sends a message directly to the control unit, which regulates the amount of fuel sent to the cylinder by the injectors. Very confusing pictures. Whether fuel injected or carbureted, we need a method of setting this gasoline air mixture on fire in the cylinder, and that's where the ignition system comes in. So we start with a wire that comes from the battery and goes to the key, and when the key is turned all the way, part of the current is used to go to the ignition system and part to the solenoid on the starter, which both have been replaced in my vehicle. The solenoid is an electromagnetic, which, when energized, pushes the starter gear into engagement with the teeth on the flywheel, and also closes a contact which draws current from the battery. As soon as the motor starts, the key is relaxed and the solenoid drops the starter gear back away from the flywheel. And then there's an ignition coil, which is a cylinder hanging on the fan housing with 3 connections. The current from the key goes to one of the small bolts and then out through the other bolt connection to the distributor. The circuit is called the primary and puts 6 or 12 volt current in a coil in the ignition coil. It takes a lot of voltage to make a spark jump. You are starting to see that we are going to burn our gasoline mixture with a spark, and for that we need spark plugs, of course. One for each cylinder and a heavy wire from each plug to its corresponding hole around the distributor cap. The distributor is a device to time the spark impulses to the spark plug so they fire at the proper time to burn the mixture to give the power. The distributor shaft is driven round and round by a funny gear on the crankshaft. So funny, I forgot to laugh. As it goes round and round inside the distributor, it opens and closes a set of points. When the points are closed, the 6 or 12 volt current from the battery to the key goes through the primary winding in the coil through the closed points to ground. Electricity, like water, will follow the path of least resistance. If one path is closed, it will follow another. And a small cylinder called the condenser, located either outside or inside the bottom of the distributor, is part of this path. The condenser stops low voltage current and keeps it from jumping the point gap and going to the ground. So you see that when the points are closed, volt current goes directly to ground. It is only when the points are open and there's a break in this primary circuit that the coil produces high voltage, like 30,000 volts, necessary to make the spark jump to be distributed to the spark plug whose turn it is. And this happens over 7,000 times a minute. Now we've provided the 3 things necessary to the operation of the engine: fuel, air mixture, spark, and compression. And so there's cycles that make those things work. There's the power stroke, which takes place when the gas in the combustion chamber is burned and forces the piston toward the crankshaft through the connecting rod to the crankshaft throw, which translates the sideways motion and power of the moving piston in the cylinder to the round and round motion of the crankshaft. That is possibly one of the longest sentences without any types of grammar marks that I've ever seen. The valves are both closed until the burning is complete at the bottom of the stroke. Then the exhaust valve opens and the piston on its way up shoves all of the burned gases out through the exhaust manifold to the muffler, and so to the atmosphere. Oh, the piston sweeps downward again and sucks the mixture from the intake manifold to the cylinder. And when it reaches the bottom of the cylinder is full of the gasoline and air mixture, both the intake and exhaust valves close and the piston starts up on the compression stroke, which jams the mixture up into itself at a ratio of about 7:1 as the piston comes to the top again. Oh, me. There, that's not too hard. Note that I said burns oxidizes rapidly. When the air-fuel mixture explodes, as it causes a pinging noise, which indicates that the mixture is being ignited before it's completely compressed, and that a change in the timing of the engine is needed. If your engine pings due to a change in altitude or fuel octane, the spark timing should be slowed down. The Volkswagen engine is air-cooled, which means that the heat of combustion in the cylinder and heads is carried away by the flow of air. These parts are cast with fins to aid in the removal of heat. A blower is provided to force air down through the spaces between the fins to carry the heat to the atmosphere. The entire engine is shrouded by sheet metal to hold the flowing air to its most efficient path. Thus, The blower in Type 1 and Type 2 up to 1971 engines is attached to the back of the generator and is thus driven with the generator by a belt from the crankshaft pulley. The blower is encased in a fan housing, which is attached to the shrouding to make an airtight assembly. The cooling air is sucked from the front of the fan housing and blown down through the cylinders. In Types 2, which is what I have, the fan is attached to the rear of the crankshaft and thus is driven directly. The generator to the left on the Type 3s and to the right on the Type 4s is driven by a belt. The oil cooler is laid on its side and the resulting flat profile has resulted in the name pancake engine. So, the generator or alternator is an electrical device which makes 6 or 12 volt current to charge the battery and to supply directly the lights when running at night. The starter motor is a simple 6 or 12 volt electric motor used to turn the engine over for starting. The voltage regulator is a box with a lot of wires coming out of it, either on top of the generator or bolted to the side of the engine compartment, which controls the current and voltage to the battery and acts as a relay to operate the lights directly at night. Structurally, the VW Bug uses a bottom pan, which is part of the body itself as a frame to bolt the running gear onto the bottom and the seats and the things on the top. The bus is much the same idea, but does have a frame to give added strength. This is very simple, but we'll give you some answers to how the Volkswagen does what it does. That would conclude Chapter 2. Next time, we'll go into Chapter 3, which is how to buy a Volkswagen. Have a great day, everybody.